Hello, today we're going to give a presentation about the labor market discrimination. Here are the topics that we're going to touch today. At first, we're going to talk about a bit of theoretical background of discrimination in the labor market, and then have a look at 3 studies, one regarding religious discrimination, another one about gender, and racial discrimination. To start off, what is labor market discrimination? It's where equally skilled workers, no matter their gender, race, national origin, age, sexual orientation, will have different earnings and different opportunities, even though they have the same skills. So the question that comes into your mind would be, is it always prejudice? Not always, because customers, workers, and employers as well, they use gender and race and any other relevant personal traits regarding someone to fill in the information gaps about those participants in the marketplace. And the most obvious type of labor discrimination is wage discrimination. And the conditions necessary for this to include are the degree of monopsony, which is something we saw before in our course, and the ability to identify separate different groups of workers, and then the elasticity of the supply of the work of those different racial or marginalized groups. The economic impacts of discrimination in the labor force include that the marginal rate of product of favored groups are overestimated, while the marginal rate of product for those discriminated against is undervalued, and it distorts the working of the market mechanism because it causes inefficiency and market failure, as there might be an overpayment or underpayment of specific work groups. And then the supply of labor from minority groups will decrease as they become discouraged to work and stop putting forward applications. They're basically discouraged to work. And it's because the system kind of works against them, and this reduces their human capital and productivity because they have the same skill set, but they're not being treated the same. In order to quantify empirically the discrimination in the workplace and in wages, here is the model that is used. And if an employer discriminates against Black people, the discrimination coefficient would be D, and if the wage of the Black people times 1 plus the discrimination coefficient is more than the wage for white people, then the firm will only hire white people as the wage is lower, so the cost for labor would be low, and vice versa would work as well. If the if the wage for white would be higher, so having Black people would be cheaper, so that then they would only hire Black people, as long as the workers are perfect substitutes and firms have a segregated workforce for only Black or whites. But is it actually profitable if businesses discriminate? It actually is not profitable. And in this case, then the firms would only hire Black or white population for their labor force. And then if they hire only Black workers because it's cheap, then they will have too few. And then if they hire only white, then they would also have too few and also would pay higher wages for them. So the profits will plummet, and it will not be profitable to be in business. The cases we talked about before were about taste-based discrimination. Now let's have a look at statistical discrimination. In this case, the test score also represents their productivity and their knowledge. So, and the graph, the first graph actually shows you that even if the test score is the same, a worker that's Black would get a lower wage than a worker that is white. And this actually shows that the worker's racial background affects a lot their wage in general. But in the second graph, if the test is a better predictor of productivity for the white workers, then high-scoring whites are going to earn more than high-scoring Blacks, and then vice versa, below the intersection point, low-scoring Blacks are going to have a higher wage than low-scoring whites.
I'm looking at religious discrimination in France's labor market. Religious discrimination varies from country to country. In this particular study, we're looking at France, and the religion we're looking at is Islam. The France are recovering with Muslims, evidence from a field experiment in the labor market. This is an experiment that was carried out in 2019 in Paris. The aim was to determine whether Muslims face unfair discrimination when applying for jobs in various firms. There are 4 treatment arms: the religious culture, religiosity, gender, and quality treatment. The design of the experiment. In these experiments, researchers create resumes for fictitious individuals wearing the religious background of those people, and then submit applications to job openings. The question is, how frequently those individuals receive a callback or an email from their employer. The resumes sent out varied according to the treatment group. The religious culture treatment consisted of randomizing the religion the applicant grew up in. In order to show this, the names of the applicants were randomized. In order to get names, they got the 5 most common Christian names and 5 most common Muslim names. And these are the names that the fictitious individuals got. Another thing that they randomized was the schools that the individuals grew up in. So for those who were Christian, they went to school in a Christian school. So in the name of the school, it was a Catholic school. So it was very apparent that it was a Catholic school. And for the Muslims, they went to an Islamic school. This is something that would insinuate what religion the individual belongs to. Religiosity treatment consists of randomizing the type, either non-religious or religious. This was seen in the outside interest part of the individual's CV, where for somebody who is more religious, they would engage in activities such as teaching in Sunday school, teaching the Quran, and things like those, and for the people who are non-religious, did not have anything to do with religion in the outside interests category. The gender treatment randomized male and female gender. The quality treatment consists of randomizing whether the application is good or outstanding. This was seen to the GPA of the individual and the proficiency in English and French. Results. Muslims are discriminated against in France. The callback rate for applicants of Muslim culture is 11.7%, which is 6.7% percentage points lower than that of the Christian counterparts. Although non-religious Muslims show consistently lower callback rates than non-religious Christians, this difference is modest and not statistically significant. However, Muslims further lose ground in the trust their religiosity unless they have an outstanding profile. This is an example of statistical discrimination, but I'll touch on that a bit later. This religiosity penalty leads religious Muslims to be discriminated against relative to non-religious Christians. The gap further widens when religious Muslims are compared to religious Christians. So for a religious Muslim, they have the biggest penalty, whereas a religious Christian does not suffer any penalty for their religion. So is it statistical or taste-based? The paper suggests that anti-Muslim hiring discrimination is statistical. Recruiters discriminate against religious Muslims unless their CV is outstanding. This finding is consistent with religious Muslims being associated to a risk of problematic behavior in the workplace that leads to discrimination when the quality of their CV is not sufficient to counterbalance that risk. This means that for a Muslim who is especially religious, for them to be hired, they have to be an outstanding candidate in comparison to a Christian counterpart. However, if the CV is not outstanding or not any more better than the next Christian counterpart, the chance of them being hired is very low. However, this does not mean that anti-Muslim taste-based discrimination is not at work outside of the hiring process. In a lab experiment that seeks to mimic everyday interaction with strangers, researchers show that French people with no recent immigration background exhibit an unprovoked animus against Muslim immigrants that does not emerge when they interact with Christian immigrants from the same country of origin. The country of origin in this experiment was Senegal. So are there any solutions to this problem? Employers can reduce the risk of discriminatory employment decisions by establishing written objective criteria for evaluating candidates for hire or promotion and applying those criteria consistently to all candidates. This can be evaluated through a program where CVs are all run digitally and automatically sorted in accordance with the company's objective criteria. So in order to reduce discrimination, I feel like the context that an employer has with the CV should be further in the hiring process, where a program already sorts the CVs and sort them according to what the company wants and what the company is looking for. So factors such as religion and your name and the religion of the school that you went to isn't a factor that is played in whether you're going to be hired or not. Yes, discrimination is still going to be there, but it could be reduced significantly if a candidate is evaluated for what they can bring to a company rather than small things such as religion.
So now I'm going to focus on gender discrimination in the US. And I would start by saying that obviously it's no secret that female employees face challenges in the workplace. And some industries, of course, more than others, have deeply rooted practices of discrimination against women, which have made inequalities much harder to eradicate. And in fact, even those women who have made it, they still face unequal pay, gender discrimination, sexual harassment. But interestingly enough, a study by Mark Egan, Gregor Matvalls, and Amit Seru, it indicates that women in finance may also be confronted with a double standard when it comes to discipline over workplace misdeeds. The study is titled When Harry Fired Sally, the Double Standard in Punishing Misconduct. And it was published in March 2017. And what it essentially concluded was that in the financial advisory industry, there are substantial differences in the punishment of misconduct among genders. What the study finds is that women commit less misconduct, yet they're punished disproportionately, which reveals that even though men in the financial industry are more than twice as likely to engage in misconduct, women are 20% more likely to be fired. The research also finds that financial firms with primarily male leaders are less likely to hire women with blemishes on their employment records. Those same companies are more inclined to inflict severe punishment on women who make errors. Male executives are more likely to overlook the misbehavior of other men, and women who get fired for misconduct are 30% less likely than male advisors to find a job. Okay, so the design of the study, it looks at this issue across the entire US financial sector, and by constructing a unique data set containing information on all the 1.2 million registered financial advisors operating in the US between 2005 and 2015, the authors used this data set to ask whether firms treat male and female financial advisors differently after they have been accused of misconduct. So if we ask ourselves, maybe female advisors receive harsher treatment than males because their misconduct costs the firms more money, or maybe because the women are less productive than the men and therefore they're easier to fire. But according to the study's conclusion, there is absolutely no evidence to support any of these reasons for the unequal treatment of women in finance. And in fact, the data points solidly in the direction of employer discrimination against female financial advisors. By finding that men are 3 times as likely to engage in misconduct, are 2 times as likely to be repeat offenders, and they participate in misconduct that is 20% costlier. So then, the researchers are claiming that there is no evidence that productivity is a factor in the harsher treatment of women. And instead, they argued that actually what's driving this behavior is taste-based discrimination. So for females, a disproportionate share of misconduct complaints is initiated by the firm rather than the customers or the regulators. And this is called taste-based discrimination, which was what previously was explained by ABBA in the religious discrimination study. But in this case, it occurs when men, either consciously or unconsciously, they prefer and choose to work with other men. And of course, as with any other type of discrimination, this leads to the exclusion of anyone who doesn't fit into the dominant group. In this case, it's women, but in other cases, it's obviously other minority groups. The authors also note that taste-based discrimination is often hidden and hard to identify. And in the case of women in finance, it's only after observing that on average, the male advisors were not fired for similar transgressions that one can actually detect the discrimination. Of course, they only look at the financial sector, but the findings can obviously be applied more broadly to other traditionally male-dominated industries. Solutions, well, as with the other challenges that women face in the workplace, it's important to obviously confront taste-based discrimination and work to address it systematically, but also the introduction of a new and potentially costly form of discrimination, which is known as the gender punishment gap. So the discrimination could be particularly costly here because it's less noticeable, and those engaging in discrimination may not even be aware actually of their inherent biases. But the gender punishment gap could have it could have important long-term consequences for women in the financial advisory industry, but just as well in other sectors, in other human capital intensive sectors.
Let's categorize what racial discrimination is. Racial discrimination is any form of discrimination on the premonition of someone's skin color or racial ethnic background. Within this study, it is categorized as the differential treatment of someone due to race or ethnicity in the labor market. One example of this would be if someone wasn't provided a job interview purely based on the color of their skin and not based on whether they'd be able to perform in the job well and what their productivity level would be. Dmitry Masterov in 2005 found that there was a significant wage differential and employment differential prevalent between Black and white people in the US, even when controlling for factors such as education and skills. This just goes to show that racial discrimination in the workplace is not just historical and is still very prevalent in today's society, and as recent as studies in 2005. So let's go on to the Australian case study. So Peter A. Ryak and Judith Rich have looked extensively into racial discrimination in the British labour market, but they decided to look into the unique case of Victoria's labour market in Australia. They identified two different immigrating groups into the labour market. They found the two groups were Greek and Vietnamese people. And this is interesting because it allows them for a comparison between a European group with a long history of immigration into Australia and other countries, and an Asian group which has very little history of immigration. So it's interesting to see how the market responds to them. So now I'll talk about the design of the Victoria study. So they use correspondence testing, which is how most studies look into racial discrimination in the workplace. Two carefully matched fictitious applicants are forwarded in a response to a job vacancy. And the logic of the technique is to control for strictly all the objective factors that make you good for a job or make you more applicable for a job, such as education, qualifications, experience, and overall performance. So that obviously they used two standard letters of application, which were sent in response to job advertisements. Letters created so that only effective distinction was their race, so that they could purely, unbiasedly look at the race and how that influenced whether they got the job. Ensuring that there are no unintended bias occurs. So both female and male participants used in the study. Job applicants sent on the same day to ensure equal timelines, and the letter type alternated regularly, so not to look suspicious to the people receiving job applications. So if we look at the results, there were two forms of discrimination that were shown. There was the non-immigrant was provided a job interview, whereas the immigrant wasn't provided the job interview. And the second form of discrimination was a bit more unique, and it was the idea that both were provided the job interview, but the immigrant was actually provided at a much later date to the non-immigrant, putting them at more of a disadvantage in terms of they're less likely to get the job then, aren't they? substantial evidence provided to show discrimination against the Vietnamese applicants over the European applicants, which might be because the lack of history and the more of an unknown in terms of how they work and productivity wise, because obviously the Europeans had a history with immigration, so they're more likely to understand productivity levels on average of the Europeans. So the net rate of discrimination against Vietnamese in this secretarial role was 29%, which is pretty high. The chi-square test on male applicants shows a huge amount of significance to reject the null hypothesis that Vietnamese workers are not racially discriminated against in the labour force in Victoria, and shows clear taste-based discrimination. It shows that it was purely based on their ethnicity that they didn't get the job. It's not because they were thought to be weaker workers, because obviously the applications for both jobs were very similar in terms of qualifications. So they were both equally equipped to get the job. And the solutions, well, ever since the study was carried out in the 90s, many actions from different governments have come into force